Are you ready, kids?
Ahoy there, mateys, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today we've got Season 1, Episode 17, Arrgh and Rock Bottom, both of which presumably aired on March 15th, 2000. And both of these are pure adventure episodes. Like, they have some elements of pure comedy, but their goals are to tell stories at the end of the day. One of them is really excellent at it, and one of them just so happens to be one of my favorite episodes of the whole show. So this is going to be a very fun SpongeComs, a very optimistic one, and let's get right into it. Arrgh was written by Sherm Cohen, Vincent Waller, and Meriwether Williams. Sherm and Vincent were very new to the show at this point, this being Vincent's first writing credit. I think Sherm had been around before then. But Vincent still works on the show today and is basically the guy to ask online about certain aspects of SpongeBob's production, because he was around from the near beginning, and he just is really funny when he wants to be. Like, say what you want about his decisions as creative director over the years, but this was one of his first episodes, and he really knocked it out of the park. And I think that it is also a good showcase of how SpongeBob writers can work as like a dichotomy between like the main heroes and the not so main heroes of an episode, because I can see a lot of Sherm in SpongeBob and Patrick and their outlook on life and the story, and I can see a lot of Vincent in Mr. Krabs and his willingness to get things over with, his willingness to be assertive. And this is just a basic SpongeBob trivia thing, something that's becoming a bit more debated in SpongeBob's fandom. But the reason I said that this episode presumably aired on March 15th, 2000 is because information from those days is pretty hard to find now, and Nickelodeon had a habit of labeling reruns as new episodes, so it's very hard for us to determine which is truth and which is reruns. Personally, I'll be going with the originally presumed air dates until further notice, but it is something to bring up in case the schedule for SpongeComs gets a little rough. So anyway, board game jokes. That's what this episode starts with. That's what any episode of SpongeBob should start with. Just kidding. I don't think SpongeBob has like a very, oh, and there's Fred. That's one of his most famous lines. And I think this is the first time they've made a my leg joke with that model. Like one of the first models on the model sheet, and it just says, we call him Fred. So I think that they knew that they had a very funny character from the get-go. So anyway, board game jokes. Honestly, I do like me a board game from time to time, but I am not a board game genius. I can slightly identify the conventions that they're parodying, like a treasure chest and looking through a window and like trivia cards, jail cards. But I don't have enough experience to determine what they're referencing. Like the SpongeBob wiki just says that it's referencing board games like Monopoly, which shows you how much Monopoly has a monopoly on board games. No, but my favorite's the Game of Life, but I'm getting off topic. Mr. Krabs really seems to be invested in this one because it's about treasure, and I think this is one of those cases where his greediness is sort of justified because he was very concerned about the Krusty Krab's lack of activity at the start of the episode, and here we see him get excited about the prospect of making a ton of money just by looking for it, just by going on an adventure. And I also think that it's one of the most sensible ways of starting a Slow Day at the Krusty Krab job episode, because you don't really focus on it too much after the first 10 seconds. It is very quick. It gets to the point. It isn't like season 7 and 8 where they dwell on it for the first 5 minutes of the episode. I think we're only about 3 or 4 minutes in, and they already have established plot points, they already have a good theme going for them, and they're making a lot of great pirate jokes. And that's another thing this episode does really well, the pirate jokes. Granted, like with board games, I'm not the most knowledgeable on pirate history or pirate fiction. I can imagine that they are parodying a lot of pirate-themed movies and literature, but I've only consumed the basics, like the essentials, like Treasure Island. But I do understand the appeal of it. I mean, this episode is very, very appealing in a lot of ways, because they do get to make fun of pirates and their ways of speaking and adventuring. I don't think it's offending that many pirates, because there aren't that many in the way they were in the Tudor and Stuart days. But piratehood has always been a valuable part of the SpongeBob style. Mr. Krabs has always spoken like a sailor, and there's always been Painty the Pirate at the start, and then in season 2 we get Patchy the Pirate, and over time we get more like pirate stuff. The Flying Dutchman in this episode especially. So this is a very good way to just showcase all the pirate jokes that they could possibly do, like really digging into their way of speaking, going arrgh all the time. Just looking over my notes here. Oh, a couple paces earlier, we saw Mr. Krabs holding out the treasure map, and we get a brief glimpse of the general shape of the map being the same as the board game board. But I do really like that they kind of cheat the audience, because they make it like a flat piece of paper here and in a later scene, while when they eventually want to show you that it is the board, then it becomes the board. I don't know why, but I just find that to be a very clever detail. Like, it's sort of breaking reality, but it's doing it in a way that you'll hardly ever notice on your first 50 watches. And this is something that has always been I've sort of debated in my head in this episode, is Mr. Krabs going too far here? And honestly, after a couple years of thinking about it, absolutely not, because of just the ideas they're playing with, how they want Mr. Krabs to receive his comeuppance, and how they want it to still focus on SpongeBob and Patrick, how you still want to root for them, even though Patrick hasn't bathed in weeks. And SpongeBob is just... This is another one of those episodes where SpongeBob is a very passive observer of all these events. But he does get his yell-in at Mr. Krabs early on when he's pestering him about the board game. And I think that's some of the loudest SpongeBob's ever been. But here, it is like SpongeBob and Patrick are just kids playing with Mr. Krabs, going on this fun little escapade, whereas Mr. Krabs is taking it far too seriously. Oh, and also, this is another classic scene, them really teasing that they want to see the map, and then seeing the map, and then the whole episode comes into a different context, that Mr. Krabs has been so obsessed with the board game that he's thought it was a real... I mean, obviously, Patrick says at the start that it is based on a real treasure map, because otherwise how will they sell the board game? But I do really like the angle that Mr. Krabs is this desperate for money, that he's this desperate to do something other than run his restaurant. It says a lot about who he is, who he wants to be, and I don't know if this is the best place to bring up that piratehood runs in his family. Don't know why I keep calling it piratehood. But it is an important element of this episode. He's definitely got some negative experiences with pirates, as we see much later into the show. And that has sort of rubbed off on how he goes about this. Like, he is a very stern, mean captain. But he does get a little plastic toy for all his troubles. And the last thing I wanted to bring up about this episode is the surreal elements, like the fact that this was a real treasure all along, not some sort of marketing thing. Wanted to bring up the Flying Dutchman because this is only his second appearance, third counting the brochure in Squidward the Unfriendly Ghost, and it's another really fun usage of his character. Like, he just takes most of his treasure, just gives SpongeBob and Patrick doubloons for managing to dig it up for him, and gives Mr. Krabs the little plastic treasure chest from the board game. And I think that's good payoff, because Mr. Krabs did technically go on the board game in real life, and SpongeBob and Patrick suffered enough, but still, there needs to be some sort of silver lining so that they aren't completely rich by the end, like it doesn't completely change the status quo. This ain't porous pockets here, guys. Like, you can tell by how much I've been talking about the plot points and how I like them, that I do hold a very positive opinion on this episode, even with all the sweating jokes, which aren't too disgusting either. I do think this episode had a solid sense of humour and a solid story. I like it. Rock Bottom was written by Paul Tibbett, Ennio Teresen, and David Fain. This was his first credit of 4 episodes, I want to say, and he didn't stick around long. He left after, I'd say, about halfway through season 2, but whatever he did here, he certainly left an impact, because this is my second favourite episode of season 2, second favourite episode of season 1, and is one of my favourite episodes in the whole show. I just love everything that it does, what it says, what it's like, the jokes. It all appeals to me, you know? You always have that episode of a show that's like, I really get it. And first thing on the agenda is, this is the debut of Glove World. We do briefly see it, and its merchandise is a source of running gags. And I think that the reason it was only used once in the pre-movie era, and then was used a lot more after the movie, is because SpongeBob and Patrick became more kid-like after then. Like, you had more episodes like Roller Cowards and The Abrasive Side, where Glove World needed to be a big part of their motivations or their obstacles or something, because they were more kid-like in that era. Whereas here, they are certainly kid-like, but you could argue that this is a struggle that both kids and adults go through, not having much experience with how buses work and how not to wait for one. Because even though this episode is incredibly hard on SpongeBob, it doesn't take too long to wait for a bus on a good day. Like, unless there's some sort of moral panic, like there is, like, the day I'm recording this. You typically do have to be very patient at the bus stop, and SpongeBob was certainly not a very bus-friendly individual at the very start of the episode, when he was just slapping his glove balloon around. Glove slap, baby glove slap. I digress. When he was just slapping his glove balloon around at the bus driver. I like to think that somehow that bus driver is driving every single bus that SpongeBob fails to get from here on out. Like, it would be the ultimate payback. I know that if this were written into the episode, it would kind of sully it, would ruin some of the mystery surrounding Rock Bottom, but it's just a funny little headcanon that I have. And about Rock Bottom, this is such a great location. I love it. And I'm really happy that it was used not too much later on, but it does still have some of its presence. keyword being some, because I really didn't like how they used it in Out of the Picture, but in terms of how it's used in the original episode, it is really brilliant that they went into the aphotic zone, the deep ocean, for inspiration. That's basically a portion of the ocean where there is no sunlight, and there are certainly some fish, like anglerfish, that have lights on them, but not that many. Like, it is a wild west down there, like a lot of different creepy types of specimens. And it's something that I do really like about this episode, that they managed to evoke this creepy atmosphere and make a lot of creepy designs. Oh, and here's SpongeBob tying his shoe. This shouldn't be a problem by the end of the year. They make a lot of these creepy designs, and it all makes sense both in the context of marine biology and the context of what this episode is saying about being lost in an unknown location after a faulty bus or a unreliable bus, because inexperienced kids and even inexperienced adults do sometimes take the wrong bus and wind up in these strange locations. It is not a phenomenon, but it is something that happens. It happened to me once when I was like 13, and it was really strange. And this episode kind of plays to that strangeness. And that is something that I really do appreciate about it, especially after my experience. However, I can know why this episode isn't really for everyone, because it is a very trollish episode. The buses are either super annoying or cathartic, depending on your views of public transport, your experiences, if you've ever used them, if you've used them for several years at a time. Thing is, even though I do have some bad experiences and they've never been super reliable for me, I can kind of laugh at this episode's portrayal of them because of those bad experiences. Not that I'm laughing at SpongeBob to insult him, I'm laughing because I can empathize with him. That's how it works for me. This is just one of the funniest scenes in all of season 1, just SpongeBob going to the candy machine and constantly missing buses. Like, it's kind of showing that SpongeBob is... I don't think I've seen any candy machine where you have to press that many buttons, but I digress. It's showing that SpongeBob is running out of time. He is getting very hungry and tired. And these are some fantastic reaction shots there. Like, you don't need to be super exaggerated to be super funny. You just need some good timing. That's something that season 10, 11, and 12 sometimes fail to get. Oh, and of course this joke. Apparently SpongeBob's arm controls where the bus is on its journey. And of course he still loses. And I think that's the same guy who came out of the bathroom earlier in the episode, and the Buzz receptionist. Now here we get some like standard cartoon gags. Only 2, like, it doesn't follow rule of 3, but they are still pretty good gags, even if they're not the most memorable part of the episode. Now, a little happy or unhappy coincidence with this line scene is that at one point SpongeBob ends up the proud 329th guy in line after seeing a lot of brooding gentlemen. Fun fact, Face Freeze, one of the ugliest episodes of the show, is the 329th in the standard order that we use. That number has always stuck out to me, and when I got to that episode and the reevaluation, I just found it to be a pretty happy coincidence and reminded me of an actually good episode. I don't think that we ever see SpongeBob this angry this often in season 1. Like, he is a bit of a grump in season 3, especially near the end. And that is not a Pokeball, guys. That is just a buoy, I think, a buoy, or a life preserver that they stuck a clock in. I could be totally wrong. This is one of the last things that's fully introduced to Rock Bottom, the raspberry talk, the raspberry talk. I don't know. I guess it is a fart joke, and fart jokes aren't too clever, but I think that this is legitimately clever. I don't really think of it as a fart joke. I think of it as just a thing that kids do, because kids did do it. Kids still do it, I think. They might not, because it might spread coronavirus, but wow, that dated the SpongeComs. But yeah, I don't think of this as a particularly dull joke. Like, it does perfectly show how a kid would think a different person speaks, why it'd be weird or creepy or, in some cases, funny to them. Oh, and the lighting, the colors near the end of the episode in this climax, this is all really good as well. I don't know if the glove light would turn off unless it's pressure building down this deep in the ocean. But in which case, SpongeBob will just collapse in on himself because he is such a weakling this season. And this is also another really good joke. Just the fact that they make the raspberries so ominous, they are able to make them so ominous. It's a really good thing. I think that SpongeBob is just at the end of his rope now. He is backed into a corner, and he's in all these different shapes. It's another thing that I really love about this episode, that they just make SpongeBob all these different things. He'll shrink into his clothes to fight himself inside their rage and all. And he'll just stretch and expand. And he'd become like the bus stop table chair. Words are escaping me at the moment. All that's on my mind is... And this nice little sweet ending that shows that not all people in strange places or the deep sea are bad. Don't know if everyone who's ever been in this experience will agree with me, but it does lead into the only flaw in this episode, that horrible JPEG of SpongeBob's house on that scene in Bikini Bottom. Like, that looks terrible. I'm sure even in 2000 or 2003 it might have aired, that would have looked very out of place. But regardless, this is a really good episode, and my second favorite of the season, next to Pizza Delivery, which shares some of its themes. And my question of the week for you this week is, what's your favorite location outside of Bikini Bottom? It can be Rock Bottom, it can be Shell City, it can be basically anything that isn't within Bikini Bottom's city limits or its suburb in leaving Bikini Bottom. I've got some answers for the last question of the week, favorite holiday episodes. Super Seal, Jack McGinn, and Michael Urisimia, sorry if I butchered your name, all say it's a SpongeBob Christmas. Pretty big majority. And Amazing Coconut says, I love Christmas Who, best holiday ep. And Azra Evans says, Arrgh Rock Bottom. I would have preferred Bubble Buddy because of Leif Erikson Day, but you all make strong cases. And see you next time for Walking Small and Texas, not in that order. Goodbye for now.